The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 23. Conditions for the Coming of a Spiritual Age. A change of this kind, the change from the mental and vital to the spiritual order of life, must necessarily be accomplished in the individual and in a great number of individuals before it can lay any effective hold upon the community. The spirit in humanity discovers, develops, builds its formations first in the individual man. It is through the progressive and formative individual that it offers the discovery and the chance of a new self-creation to the mind of the race. For the communal mind holds things subconsciously at first, or if consciously, then in a confused, chaotic manner. It is only through the individual mind that the mass can arrive at a clear knowledge and creation of the thing it held in its subconscious self. Thinkers, historians, sociologists who belittle the individual and would like to lose him in the mass, or think of him chiefly as a cell, an atom, have got hold only of the obscurer side of the truth of nature's workings in humanity. It is because man is not like the material formations of nature, or like the animal, because she intends in him a more and more conscious evolution. That individuality is so much developed in him and so absolutely important and indispensable. No doubt what comes out in the individual and afterwards moves the mass must have been there already in the universal mind, and the individual is only an instrument for its manifestation, discovery, development. But he is an indispensable instrument, and an instrument not merely of subconscient nature, not merely of an instinctive urge that moves the mass, but more directly of the spirit of whom that nature is itself the instrument and the matrix of his creations. All great changes, therefore, find their first clear and effective power and their direct shaping force in the mind and spirit of an individual, or of a limited number of individuals. The mass follows, but unfortunately, in a very imperfect and confused fashion, which often, or even usually, ends in the failure or distortion of the thing created. If it were not so, mankind could have advanced on its way with a victorious rapidity, instead of with the lumbering hesitations and soon exhausted rushes that seem to be all of which it has yet been capable. Therefore, if the spiritual change of which we have been speaking is to be effected, it must unite two conditions which have to be simultaneously satisfied, but are most difficult to bring together. There must be the individual and the individuals who are able to see, to develop, to recreate themselves in the image of the Spirit, and to communicate both their idea and its power to the mass. And there must be, at the same time, a mass, a society, a communal mind, or at least the constituents of a group body, the possibility of a group soul, which is capable of receiving and effectively assimilating, ready to follow and effectively arrive, not compelled by its own inherent deficiencies. Its defect of preparation to stop on the way or fall back before the decisive change is made. Such a simultaneity has never yet happened, although the appearance of it has sometimes been created by the ardor of a moment. That the combination must happen someday is a certainty, but none can tell how many attempts will have to be made, and how many sediments of spiritual experience will have to be accumulated in the subconscious mentality of the communal human being before the soil is ready. For the chances of success are always less powerful in a difficult upward effort affecting the very roots of our nature than the numerous possibilities of failure. The initiator himself may be imperfect, may not have waited to become entirely the thing that he has seen. Even the few who have the apostolate in their charge may not have perfectly assimilated and shaped it in themselves, and may hand on the power of the Spirit, still farther diminished, to the many who will come after them. The society may be intellectually, vitally, ethically, temperamentally unready, with the result that the final acceptance of the spiritual idea by the society may be also the beginning of its debasement and distortion, and of the consequent departure or diminution of the Spirit. Any or all of these things may happen, and the result will be, as has so often happened in the past, that even though some progress is made and an important change effected, it will not be the decisive change which can alone recreate humanity in a diviner image. What, then, will be that state of society? What that readiness of the common mind of man which will be most favorable to this change, so that even if it cannot at once effectuate itself, it may at least make for its ways a more decisive preparation than has been hitherto possible? For that seems the most important element, since it is that. It is the unpreparedness, the unfitness of the society, or of the common mind of man, which is always the chief stumbling block. It is the readiness of this common mind which is of the first importance. For even if the condition of society and the principle and rule that govern society are opposed to the spiritual change, even if these belong almost wholly to the vital, to the external, the economic, the mechanical order, as is certainly the way at present with human masses, yet if the common human mind has begun to admit the ideas proper to the higher order that is, in the end, to be, and the heart of man has begun to be stirred by aspirations born of these ideas, then there is a hope of some advance in the not distant future. And here, the first essential sign must be the growth of the subjective idea of life. The idea of the soul, the inner being, its powers, its possibilities, its growth, its expression, and the creation of a true, beautiful, and helpful environment for it, as the one thing of first and last importance. The signals must be there that are precursors of a subjective age in humanity's thought and social endeavor. These ideas are likely first to declare their trend in philosophy, in psychological thinking, in the arts, poetry, painting, sculpture, music, in the main idea of ethics, in the application of subjective principles by thinkers to social questions, even perhaps, though this is a perilous effort, to politics and economics. That hard, refractory, earthy matter which most resists all but a gross utilitarian treatment. There will be new, unexpected departures of science, or at least of research, since to such a turn in its most fruitful seekings, the orthodox still deny the name of science. Discoveries will be made that thin the walls between soul and matter. Attempts there will be to extend exact knowledge into the psychological and psychic realms, with the realization of the truth that these have laws of their own which are other than the physical, but not the less laws because they escape the external senses and are infinitely plastic and subtle. There will be a labor of religion to reject its past heavy weight of dead matter and revivify its strength in the fountains of the Spirit. These are sure signs, if not of the thing to be, at least of a great possibility of it, of an effort that will surely be made, another endeavor perhaps, with a larger sweep and a better equipped intelligence, capable not only of feeling, but of understanding the truth that is demanding to be heard. Some such signs we can see at the present time, although they are only incipient and sporadic, and have not yet gone far enough to warrant a confident certitude. It is only when these groping beginnings have found that for which they are seeking, that it can be successfully applied to the remolding of the life of man. Till then, nothing better is likely to be achieved than an inner preparation, and for the rest, radical or revolutionary experiments of a doubtful kind, with the details of the vast and cumbrous machinery under which life now groans and labors. A subjective age may stop very far short of spirituality, for the subjective turn is only a first condition not the thing itself, not the end of the matter. The search for the reality, the true self of man, may very easily follow out the natural order described by the Upanishad in the profound apologue of the seekings of Bhrigu, son of Varuna. For first the seeker found the ultimate reality to be matter and the physical, the material being, the external man, our only self and spirit. Next, he fixed on life as the reality, and the vital being as the self and spirit. In the third essay, he penetrated to mind and the mental being. Only afterwards could he get beyond the superficial, subjective, through the supramental truth consciousness to the eternal, the blissful, the ever-creative reality, of which these are the sheaths. But humanity may not be as persistent or as plastic as the son of Varuna. The search may stop short anywhere. Only if it is intended that he shall now at last arrive and discover, will the spirit break each insufficient formula as soon as it has shaped itself, and compel the thought of man to press forward to a larger discovery, and in the end to the largest and most luminous of all. Something of the kind has been happening, but only in a very external way and on the surface. After the material formula, which governed the greater part of the 19th century, had burdened man with the heaviest servitude to the machinery of the outer material life that he has ever yet been called upon to bear, the first attempt to break through, to get to the living reality in things and away from the mechanical idea of life and living and society, landed us in that surface vitalism which had already begun to govern thought before the two formulas, inextricably locked together, lit up and flung themselves on the lurid pyre of the World War. The vital elan has brought us no deliverance, but only used the machinery already created with a more feverish insistence, a vehement attempt to live more rapidly, more intensely, an inordinate will to act and to succeed, to enlarge the mere force of living, or to pile up a gigantic efficiency of the collective life. It could not have been otherwise, even if this vitalism had been less superficial and external, more truly subjective. To live, to act, to grow, to increase the vital force, to understand, utilize, and fulfill the intuitive impulse of life, are not things evil in themselves. Rather, they are excellent things, if rightly followed and rightly used. That is to say, if they are directed to something beyond the mere vitalistic impulse, and are governed by that within which is higher than life. The life power is an instrument, not an aim. It is in the upward scale the first great subjective supraphysical instrument of the spirit, and the base of all action and endeavor. but a life power that sees nothing beyond itself, nothing to be served except its own organized demands and impulses, will be very soon like the force of steam driving an engine without the driver, or an engine in which the locomotive force has made the driver its servant and not its controller. It can only add the uncontrollable impetus of a high-crested or broad-based Titanism, or it may even be a nether flaming demonism to the nature forces of the material world, with the intellect as its servant, an impetus of measureless, unresting creation, appropriation, expansion, which will end in something violent, huge, and colossal, foredoomed in its very nature to excess and ruin, because light is not in it, nor the soul's truth, nor the sanction of the gods, and their calm, eternal will and knowledge. But beyond the subjectivism of the vital self, there is the possibility of a mental subjectivism, which would at first perhaps, emerging out of the predominant vitalism and leaning upon the already realized idea of the soul as a soul of life in action, but correcting it, appear as a highly mentalized pragmatism. This first stage is foreshadowed in an increasing tendency to rationalize entirely man and his life, to govern individual and social existence by an ordered scientific plan based upon his discovery of his own and of life's realities. This attempt is bound to fail, because reason and rationality are not the whole of man or of life, because reason is only an intermediate interpreter, not the original knower, creator, and master of our being or of cosmic existence. It can, besides, only mechanize life in a more intelligent way than in the past. To do that seems to be all that the modern intellectual leaders of the race can discover as the solution of the heavy problem with which we are impaled. But it is conceivable that this tendency may hereafter rise to the higher idea of man as a mental being, a soul in mind that must develop itself individually and collectively in the life and body through the play of an ever-expanding mental existence. This greater idea would realize that the elevation of the human existence will come not through material efficiency alone, or the complex play of his vital and dynamic powers, not solely by mastering through the aid of the intellect the energies of physical nature for the satisfaction of the life instincts, which can only be an intensification of his present mode of existence, but through the greatening of his mental and psychic being, and a discovery, bringing forward, and organization of his subliminal nature and its forces, the utilization of a larger mind and a larger life waiting for discovery within us. It would see in life an opportunity for the joy and power of knowledge, for the joy and power of beauty, for the joy and power of the human will mastering not only physical nature, but vital and mental nature. It might discover her yet undreamed of mind powers and life powers, and use them for a freer liberation of man from the limitations of his shackled bodily life. It might arrive at new psychic relations, a more sovereign power of the idea to realize itself in the act, inner means of overcoming the obstacles of distance and division, which would cast into insignificance even the last miraculous achievements of material science. A development of this kind is far enough away from the dreams of the mass of men, but there are certain pale hints and presages of such a possibility, and ideas which lead to it are already held by a great number, who are perhaps, in this respect, the yet unrecognized vanguard of humanity. It is not impossible that behind the confused mourning voices of the hour, a light of this kind, still below the horizon, may be waiting to ascend with its splendors. Such a turn of human thought, effort, ideas of life, if it took hold of the communal mind, would evidently lead to a profound revolution throughout the whole range of human existence. It would give it from the first a new tone and atmosphere, a loftier spirit, wider horizons, a greater aim. It might easily develop a science which would bring the powers of the physical world into a real and not only a contingent and mechanical subjection, and open perhaps the doors of other worlds. It might develop an achievement of art and beauty which would make the greatness of the past a comparatively little thing, and would save the world from the astonishingly callous reign of utilitarian ugliness that even now afflicts it. It would open up a closer and freer interchange between human minds, and, it may well be hoped, a kindlier interchange between human hearts and lives. Nor need its achievements stop here, but might proceed to greater things, of which these would be only the beginnings. This mental and psychic subjectivism would have its dangers, greater dangers even than those that attend a vitalistic subjectivism, because its powers of action also would be greater. But it would have what vitalistic subjectivism has not, and cannot easily have: the chance of a detecting discernment, strong safeguards, and a powerful, liberating light. Moving with difficulty upward from matter to spirit, this is perhaps a necessary stage of man's development. This was one principal reason of the failure of past attempts to spiritualize mankind, that they endeavored to spiritualize at once the material man by a sort of rapid miracle. And though that can be done, the miracle is not likely to be of an enduring character. If it overleaps the stages of his ascent, and leaves the intervening levels untrodden and therefore unmastered. The endeavor may succeed with individuals, Indian thought would say, with those who have made themselves ready in a past existence, but it must fail with the mass. When it passes beyond the few, the forceful miracle of the Spirit flags, unable to transform by inner force the new religion, for that is what it becomes, tries to save by machinery, is entangled in the mechanical turning of its own instruments, loses the Spirit, and perishes quickly, or decays slowly. That is the fate which overtakes all attempts of the vitalistic, the intellectual and mental, the spiritual endeavor to deal with material man through his physical mind chiefly, or alone. The endeavor is overpowered by the machinery it creates, and becomes the slave and victim of the machine. That is the revenge which our material nature, herself mechanical, takes upon all such violent endeavors. She waits to master them by their concessions to her own law. If mankind is to be spiritualized, it must first, in the mass, cease to be the material or the vital man, and become the psychic and the true mental being. It may be questioned whether such a mass progress or conversion is possible. But if it is not, then the spiritualization of mankind as a whole is a chimera. From this point of view, it is an excellent thing, a sign of great promise, that the wheel of civilization has been following its past and present curve upward from a solid physical knowledge through a successive sounding of higher and higher powers that mediate between matter and spirit. The human intellect in modern times has been first drawn to exhaust the possibilities of materialism by an immense dealing with life and the world upon the basis of matter as the sole reality, matter as the eternal, matter as the Brahman, Anam Brahma. Afterwards, it had begun to turn towards the conception of existence as the large pulsation of a great evolving life, the creator of matter, which would have enabled it to deal with our existence on the basis of life as the original reality, life as the great eternal Prano Brahma. And already it has in germ, in preparation, a third conception, the discovery of a great self-expressing and self-finding inner mind, other than our surface mentality, as a master power of existence that should lead towards a rich attempt to deal with our possibilities and our ways of living on the basis of mind as the original reality, the great eternal Mano Brahma. It would also be a sign of promise if these conceptions succeeded each other with rapidity, with a large but swift evocation of the possibilities of each level, for that would show that there is a readiness in our subconscious nature, and that we need not linger in each stage for centuries. But still, a subjective age of mankind must be an adventure full of perils and uncertainties, as are all the great adventures of the race. It may wander long before it finds itself, or may not find itself at all, and may swing back to a new repetition of the cycle. The true secret can only be discovered if in the third stage, in an age of mental subjectivism, the idea becomes strong of the mind itself as no more than a secondary power of the Spirit's working, and of the Spirit as the great eternal, the original, and, in spite of the many terms in which it is both expressed and hidden, the sole reality. Ayam Atma Brahma. Then only will the real, the decisive endeavor begin, and life and the world be studied, known, dealt with in all directions as the self-finding and self-expression of the Spirit. Then only will a spiritual age of mankind be possible. To attempt any adequate discussion of what that would mean, and in an inadequate discussion there is no fruit, is beyond our present scope. For we should have to examine a knowledge which is rare, and nowhere more than initial. It is enough to say that a spiritual human society would start from and try to realize three essential truths of existence, which all nature seems to be an attempt to hide by their opposites, and which, therefore, are as yet, for the mass of mankind, only words and dreams: God, freedom, unity. Three things which are one. For you cannot realize freedom and unity unless you realize God. You cannot possess freedom and unity unless you possess God. Possess at once your highest self and the self of all creatures. The freedom and unity, which otherwise go by that name, are simply attempts of our subjection and our division to get away from themselves by shutting their eyes, while they turn somersaults around their own center. When man is able to see God and to possess Him, then he will know real freedom and arrive at real unity, never otherwise. And God is only waiting to be known, while man seeks for Him everywhere and creates images of the divine, but all the while truly finds, effectively erects, and worships images only of his own mind-ego and life-ego. When this ego pivot is abandoned and this ego hunt ceases, then man gets his first real chance of achieving spirituality in his inner and outer life. It will not be enough, but it will be a commencement, a true gate, and not a blind entrance. A spiritualized society would live, like its spiritual individuals, not in the ego, but in the spirit, not as the collective ego, but as the collective soul. This freedom from the egoistic standpoint would be its first and most prominent characteristic. But the elimination of egoism would not be brought about, as it is now proposed to bring it about, by persuading or forcing the individual to immolate his personal will and aspirations and his precious, hard-won individuality to the collective will, aims, and egoisms of the society, driving him, like a victim of ancient sacrifice, to slay his soul on the altar of that huge and shapeless idol. For that would be only the sacrifice of the smaller to the larger egoism, larger only in bulk, not necessarily greater in quality or wider or nobler, since a collective egoism, result of the united egoisms of all, is as little a god to be worshipped, as flawed and often an uglier and more barbarous fetish than the egoism of the individual. What the spiritual man seeks is to find, by the loss of the ego, the self, which is one in all, and perfect and complete in each, and by living in that, to grow into the image of its perfection. Individually, be it noted, though with an all-embracing universality of his nature and its conscious circumference. It is said in the old Indian writings that while in the second age, the age of power, Vishnu descends as the king, and in the third, the age of compromise and balance, as the legislator or codifier. In the age of the truth, he descends as Yajna, that is to say, as the master of works and sacrifice, manifest in the heart of his creatures. It is this kingdom of God within, the result of the finding of God, not in a distant heaven, but within ourselves, of which the state of society, in an age of the truth, a spiritual age, would be the result and the external figure. Therefore, a society which was even initially spiritualized would make the revealing and finding of the divine self in man the supreme, even the guiding aim of all its activities, its education, its knowledge, its science, its ethics, its art, its economical and political structure, as it was to some imperfect extent in the ancient Vedic times, with the cultural education of the higher classes, so it would be then with all education. It would embrace all knowledge in its scope, but would make the whole trend and aim and the permeating spirit not mere worldly efficiency, though that efficiency would not be neglected, but this self-developing and self-finding, and all else as its powers. It would pursue the physical and psychic sciences, not in order merely to know the world and nature in her processes, and to use them for material human ends, but still more to know through and in and under and over all things the divine in the world, and the ways of the Spirit in its masks and behind them. It would make it the aim of ethics, not to establish a rule of action, whether supplementary to the social law or partially corrective of it, the social law that is, after all, only the rule, often clumsy and ignorant, of the biped pack, the human herd, but to develop the divine nature in the human being. It would make it the aim of art, not merely to present images of the subjective and objective world, but to see them with the significant and creative vision that goes behind their appearances, to reveal the truth and beauty of which things visible to us and invisible are the forms, the masks, or the symbols and significant figures. A spiritualized society would treat in its sociology the individual, from the saint to the criminal, not as units of a social problem to be passed through some skillfully devised machinery and either flattened into the social mold or crushed out of it, but as souls suffering and entangled in a net and to be rescued, souls growing and to be encouraged to grow, souls grown, and from whom help and power can be drawn by the lesser spirits who are not yet adult. The aim of its economics would be not to create a huge engine of production, whether of the competitive or the cooperative kind, but to give to men, not only to some, but to all men, each in his highest possible measure, the joy of work, according to their own nature, and free leisure, to grow inwardly, as well as a simply rich and beautiful life for all. In its politics, it would not regard the nations within the scope of their own internal life as enormous state machines regulated and armored, with man living for the sake of the machine and worshipping it as his God and his larger self, content at the first call to kill others upon its altar, and to bleed there himself, so that the machine may remain intact and powerful, and be made even larger, more complex, more cumbrous, more mechanically efficient, and entire. Neither would it be content to maintain these nations or states in their mutual relations as noxious engines, meant to discharge poisonous gas upon each other in peace, and to rush, in times of clash, upon each other's armed hosts and unarmed millions, full of belching shot, and men missioned to murder like warplanes or hostile tanks in a modern battlefield. It would regard the peoples as group souls, the divinity concealed and to be self-discovered in its human collectivities. Group souls meant like the individual to grow according to their own nature, and by that growth to help each other, to help the whole race in the one common work of humanity. And that work would be to find the divine self in the individual and the collectivity, and to realize spiritually, mentally, vitally, materially, its greatest, largest, richest, and deepest possibilities in the inner life of all and their outer action and nature. For it is into the divine within them that men and mankind have to grow. It is not an external idea or rule that has to be imposed on them from without. Therefore, The law of a growing inner freedom is that which will be most honored in the spiritual age of mankind. True it is that so long as man has not come within measurable distance of self-knowledge, and has not set his face towards it, he cannot escape from the law of external compulsion, and all his efforts to do so must be vain. He is, and always must be, so long as that lasts, the slave of others, the slave of his family, his caste, his clan, his church, his society, his nation. And he cannot but be that, and they too cannot help throwing their crude and mechanical compulsion on him, because he and they are the slaves of their own ego, of their own lower nature. We must feel and obey the compulsion of the Spirit if we would establish our inner right to escape other compulsion. We must make our lower nature the willing slave, the conscious and illumined instrument, or the ennobled but still self-subjected portion, consort or partner of the divine being within us. For it is that subjection which is the condition of our freedom, since spiritual freedom is not the egoistic assertion of our separate mind and life, but obedience to the divine truth in ourself and our members, and in all around us. But we have, even so, to remark that God respects the freedom of the natural members of our being, and that he gives them room to grow in their own nature, so that by natural growth, and not by self-extinction, they may find the divine in themselves. The subjection which they finally accept, complete and absolute, must be a willing subjection of recognition and aspiration to their own source of light and power, and their highest being. Therefore, even in the unregenerated state, we find that the healthiest, the truest, the most living growth and action is that which arises in the largest possible freedom, and that all excess of compulsion is either the law of a gradual atrophy or a tyranny varied and cured by outbreaks of rabid disorder. And as soon as man comes to know his spiritual self, he does, by that discovery, often even by the very seeking for it, as ancient thought and religion saw, escape from the outer law and enter into the law of freedom. It will not try to make man perfect by machinery, or keep him straight by tying up all his limbs. It will not present to the member of the society his higher self in the person of the policeman, the official, and the corporal, nor, let us say, in the form of a socialistic bureaucracy or a labor soviet. Its aim will be to diminish as soon and as far as possible the need of the element of external compulsion in human life, and by awakening the inner divine compulsion of the spirit within, and all the preliminary means it will use will have that for its aim. In the end, it will employ chiefly, if not solely, the spiritual compulsion which even the spiritual individual can exercise on those around him. And how much more should a spiritual society be able to do it? that which awakens within us, in spite of all inner resistance and outer denial, the compulsion of the light, the desire, and the power to grow through one's own nature into the divine. For the perfectly spiritualized society will be one in which, as is dreamed by the spiritual anarchist, all men will be deeply free, and it will be so because the preliminary condition will have been satisfied. In that state, each man will not be a law to himself, but the law, the divine law, because he will be a soul living in the divine reality, and not an ego living mainly, if not entirely, for its own interest and purpose. His life will be led by the law of his own divine nature, liberated from the ego. Nor will that mean a breaking up of all human society into the isolated action of individuals, for the third word of the Spirit is unity. The spiritual life is the flower, not of a featureless, but a conscious and diversified oneness. Each man has to grow into the divine reality within himself through his own individual being. Therefore is a certain growing measure of freedom a necessity of the being as it develops, and perfect freedom the sign and the condition of the perfect life. But also the divine whom he thus sees in himself, he sees equally in all others, and as the same Spirit in all. Therefore, too, is a growing inner unity with others, a necessity of his being and perfect unity, the sign and condition of the perfect life. Not only to see and find the divine in oneself, but to see and find the divine in all. Not only to seek one's own individual liberation or perfection, but to seek the liberation and perfection of others is the complete law of the spiritual being. If the divinity sought were a separate Godhead within oneself, and not the one divine, or if one sought God for oneself alone, then indeed the result might be a grandiose egoism, the Olympian egoism of a Goethe, or the Titanic egoism imagined by Nietzsche. Or it might be the isolated self-knowledge or asceticism of the ivory tower or the stylite's pillar. But he who sees God in all will serve freely God in all with the service of love. He will, that is to say, seek not only his own freedom, but the freedom of all, not only his own perfection, but the perfection of all. He will not feel his individuality perfect, except in the largest universality, nor his own life to be full life, except as it is one with the universal life. He will not live either for himself or for the state and society, for the individual ego or the collective ego, but for something much greater, for God in himself, and for the divine in the universe. The spiritual age will be ready to set in when the common mind of man begins to be alive to these truths and to be moved or desire to be moved by this triple or triune spirit. That will mean the turning of the cycle of social development, which we have been considering out of its incomplete repetitions on a new upward line towards its goal. For having set out, according to our supposition, with a symbolic age, an age in which man felt a great reality behind all life, which he sought through symbols, it will reach an age in which it will begin to live in that reality, not through the symbol, not by the power of the type, or of the convention, or of the individual reason and intellectual will, but in our own highest nature, which will be the nature of that reality, fulfilled in the conditions, not necessarily the same as now, of terrestrial existence. This is what the religions have seen with a more or less adequate intuition, but most often as in a glass darkly, that which they called the kingdom of God on earth, his kingdom within, in man's spirit, and therefore, for the one is the material result of the effectivity of the other, his kingdom without, in the life of the peoples.